So we're going to talk about emotions and relationships. Wow, what a big topic. We could spend the whole conference talking about emotions and relationships. Emotions do so many things in relationships, but I want to highlight one in particular because it's absolutely crucial, and honestly, I find that we're not very good at it. And the purpose that I want to focus on is this. Emotions help us to enter into the lives of and connect with others. So that's kind of the headline. Emotions help us to enter into the lives of and connect with others. Or put a slightly different way, emotions are the difference between knowing about someone and knowing someone. So what's the difference between knowing about and knowing? Well, several years ago, I did have the joy of traveling with my family to London for the very first time, and it was a wonderful trip. But that trip was filled with moments where I got to see things in person that I had only ever seen before on television or in magazines or in books. And I remember standing before Buckingham Palace with my family on the outside of the gates at Buckingham Palace. How many times had I seen Buckingham Palace on TV? How many times had I seen the guards with their bearskin hats marching around and standing at attention? Dozens of times. How many times had I seen the gold-tipped wrought iron gates? Dozens of times. But when I was there, it was an entirely different experience. As I stood there in the flesh, I saw them and knew them in an entirely different way. I put my hands on the gates. I saw the gates swing open and a motorcade come driving in. I could hear the guards barking their orders. And I thought to myself, this is what Buckingham Palace is like. Now I really know what Buckingham Palace is. And I had that experience when I stood in the nave of Westminster Cathedral, and I took in the grand heights, and I saw the stained glass, and I smelled the smells of Westminster Cathedral. And I had that experience as I stood before the crown jewels in the Tower of London, things I'd seen dozens of times, but in a sense was experiencing them, truly knowing them for the first time. I knew all about those places. I had a head full of facts and even images of those things, but actually experiencing them was quite different. And so emotions are kind of like our passport. Not a passport into other countries, but into the lives of others, so that we don't just know about them, but we know them. And we're actually able to touch their hearts and to be touched by their hearts and to know their souls and to be touched by their souls. You see the difference between knowing about and knowing? It's about experience and emotions as our way into one another's experience. The Bible actually tells us that it's the very nature of love to enter into one another's experience this way, through our emotions. If you have your Bibles, you might want to look with me to chapter 12 of Paul's letter to the Romans. In chapter 12, Paul opens with this call to live lives of worship of Christ, to live lives as living sacrifices to God, and in doing that, to be members of Christ's body, to be invested in one another's lives. And if you move down to verse 9, you'll see, well, he says, love must be sincere, or love must be genuine. And the next 10 verses or so are really kind of a laundry list of all the qualities and characteristics of sincere love. And he describes our need to be devoted to one another, to honor one another, to be joyful in hope and patient in affliction. And then when you get down to verse 15, Paul says this, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. And in that verse, I think we are invited to see and understand the entire spectrum of emotions, kind of bookended on one end with the positive emotions of joy and rejoicing, and bookended on the other end of the spectrum with the negative emotions, the painful emotions like mourning. But I want you to think about the implications of what Paul is saying in that statement. He isn't simply saying, know the facts of another person's experience or learn all about the other person's experience, though that is important. He's telling us to enter into that experience, to actually stand before the Buckingham Palace of their lives, to stand before and look at, to behold the crown jewels of their hearts and of their lives. You see, there's a big difference between knowing about someone's experience and entering into that experience, meaning the person in that experience so that you can honestly say, I am rejoicing in their rejoicing, and I'm weeping with their weeping. This passage tells us that this is one of the fundamental characteristics of sincere love, genuine love, the real thing. The real thing. When love is genuine, it does this. There's another great example of the difference between knowing about versus entering in the movie Good Will Hunting, one of my favorite movies from way back in 1997. How many of you have seen Good Will Hunting? Fantastic movie. It's Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting plays that role, the role of Will Hunting, who is a young 20-something from the south side of Boston, orphaned as a young child, raised in foster homes, physically abused, but also happens to be a genius, a mathematical genius in particular. But because of his abuse background, he's very defensive and self-destructive, and he has all kinds of walls up that don't let people in, and he really has no avenue, no way to know and explore his extraordinary gifts. But there are people in his world who want to help him. One of them is a therapist named Sean, who's played by Robin Williams. And in their first session, it's disastrous because Will doesn't really want to be there, and he's using his genius to tear apart the counselor. And he begins the session by walking around Sean's office, looking at his books and looking at photographs, doing anything he can to collect information about the counselor so he can gain emotional leverage over him and undo him. And he comes across a watercolor painting that Sean has created. And first of all, he says, well, this painting is a piece of junk. But it's a watercolor painting of a man rowing in a boat in the middle of a storm. And Will says to Robin Williams, Sean, the therapist, I can see you as a man overwhelmed by a storm, barely hanging on, the oars about to break, desperate to find safe harbor. What happened to you? What's going on in your life that you're so afraid and that you need safe harbor? Of course, the therapist is like uncomfortable. Well, let's stop talking about me. That's great. Sit down over here and let's start talking about you. And Will says, no, I want to know what happened. Was it a woman? Did a woman hurt you? Did you marry the wrong woman? And with that, Sean bolts up and pins Will Hunting to the wall. Struck a nerve, obviously. And just like livid with rage, with anger. Don't you ever say anything about my wife. And comes to his senses and lets Will go, and Will just kind of strides out of the office, mission accomplished, right? This guy's a genius. He unraveled his counselor in about 5 minutes. And when a first session ends that way, you usually don't get a second session. But lo and behold, there is a second session. This time, Sean meets Will on a bench by a lake. And Will's all cocky, sitting down next to him. Says, oh, we're going to have a taster's choice moment here, are we? And the counselor says, I stayed up about half the night thinking about what you said about that painting and about my life. And he was so upset by what Will had said until he says, I realized you're just a kid. You've never been outside of Boston. You have no idea what you're really talking about. Because you see, Will had discerned all kinds of facts about the counselor's world, but he didn't really know who this Sean person is. And listen to the way that the counselor explains the difference between knowing about and really entering in and really connecting. I think it's very powerful dialogue. So the counselor, Sean, says this to Will. So if I asked you about art, you'd probably give me the skinny on every art book ever written. Michelangelo, you know a lot about him, life's work, political aspirations, him and the Pope, sexual orientation, the whole works, right? But I bet you can't tell me what it smells like in the Sistine Chapel. You never actually stood there and looked up at that beautiful ceiling, seen that. You're a tough kid. I ask you about war, you'd probably throw Shakespeare at me, right? Once more into the breach, dear friends. But you've never been near one. You've never held your best friend's head in your lap and watched him gasp his last breath, looking to you for help. And if I asked you about love, you'd probably quote me a sonnet. But you've never looked at a woman and been totally vulnerable, known someone who could level you with her eyes, feeling like God put an angel on earth just for you, who could rescue you from the depths of hell. And you wouldn't know what it's like to be her angel and to have that love for her, to be there forever through anything, through cancer. His wife died of cancer. You wouldn't know about sitting up in a hospital room for 2 months holding her hand because the doctors could see in your eyes that the term visiting hours don't apply to you. You don't know about real loss because that only occurs when you love something more than you love yourself. And I doubt you've ever dared to love anybody that much. You presume to know everything about me because you saw a painting of mine and you ripped my life apart. You were an orphan, right? You think I know the first thing about how hard your life has been, how you feel, who you are, because I read Oliver Twist? Does that encapsulate you? Personally, I don't care about all that because you know what? I can't learn anything from you that I can't read in some book unless you want to talk about you, about who you are. Do you get it? You see the difference between knowing the facts and being there, knowing about a person versus really entering into their world. Do we do that? Do we do that as biblical counselors? I'll tell you about my most shameful day as a biblical counselor. I hadn't been counseling very long, but I remember a man came to see me, and he had lost his wife a couple years earlier, and he couldn't move on. He felt stuck in his grief, captured, by his sadness, and he wanted help. He was probably in his 50s. I was probably 27. And I listened to him talk about his wife for an hour, and at the end of the session, I brought to him the only categories I had, the ones that I thought were most important. I look at people and I think of them as worshipers, and when people's lives are going off the rails, I figure their worship's out of kilter and there's some kind of idolatry involved. So I said to this man, maybe in your love for your wife, you kind of made an idol out of her. And I think that probably on my best day, when I said that in the most winsome way I could conceive of, it was horribly offensive and a loathsome thing to say to somebody who was grieving his wife. And there was no second session. I probably should have gotten punched in the mouth by the guy, but he didn't. So we got to be really careful, right? You're gonna talk to somebody for an hour, sketch out their life on a three trees diagram, or come up with a CBT chart for their most important thoughts, and there they are on a piece of paper. I know you now. Now I can help you. Utter foolishness, right? Entering in, rejoicing with those who rejoice, weeping with those who weep. That's what sincere love does. It's not a step that you can skip. Can't get to the fixing part because we feel better about that. It's not a switch that we can turn on. It's not a performance. It's the fruit of sincere love. But we can get better at it. We can learn how to do it better. So, I'm going to give you what I think is a pretty nifty little lesson in how to do this. Just the basics, right? There's a lot to this, but I want to just kind of cover the basics with you. What is it? How do you begin to rejoice with those who rejoice and to weep with those who weep? Step one, entering in. That means hearing and understanding what they're experiencing. It's not just hearing their words. It's not just kind of getting a sense of their circumstances. It's really understanding what their experience is like for them, and in particular, listening to emotions, listening for emotional language, watching for emotional gestures, listening to their tone of voice, because that's how we're going to get their experience. I'll just use the example of adultery, okay? Because if you are paying attention at all and you are living in community, you are walking with people who have experienced the betrayal of adultery. How do you begin to enter into that? Well, a very common mistake that we make in trying to enter in is we just sort of automatically do, what would it be like for me if I was them? What would it be like for me if my spouse committed adultery? And what happens when that is our starting point is that what we often do is we end up exploring our own hearts and sort of assuming that their hearts are like ours. And so rather than learning anything about them, we're sort of just revealing ourselves. And when we start doing that, we really don't become very good judges of our own experience, because if you just sort of on the fly imagine your spouse committing an adultery, your first response might just be anger, right? So if you're imagining yourself in this person's shoes, you may end up just saying things like, wow, well, no one deserves that. And if I were you, I wouldn't put up with that for a minute. I can't speak for you. I think it's time for him to move out until he gets his act together. I mean, I am so angry for you right now, I can't stand it. And if we really want to be with them in their experience, we have to make room to hear things that we might not expect. So here are some of the things that someone whose spouse, their adultery was just revealed, might be feeling, what they might be experiencing. You might hear this: I blame myself. I've been pushing him away for years. Or, I am so ashamed. I feel humiliated. Everyone must think I'm a terrible person to deserve to be treated like this. Or they might say, I'm so afraid. I don't want to lose my husband. I don't want my family to fall apart. I don't want to start over again. I'm begging God not to make me have to start my life over again. I don't think I can face it. I don't think I can do it. Or, I don't feel anything. It's all happened so fast. I'm kind of numb. I don't know what to feel. Am I going crazy? Is that normal? You see, if you're imagining that it's happened to you, and you're just imagining being really angry about it, you're going to miss that person. You're going to miss all those experiences. You're not entering into their world. Your world is kind of eclipsing their world. Entering in means inviting them to share with you what it's like for them to be them. It's not you imagining that you're them. It's understanding what it's like for them to be them. See the difference? That's entering in. Tell me what it's like for you to be you. Tell me as much as you're willing to share. I want to get it. I want to be with you in there. Second element, connect. Connecting simply means letting them know that you've heard and you understand what they've shared with you about themselves. I tell them what I've heard. I demonstrate that I've heard. And you can keep this really simple. The person's been sharing fear, and I say, I want you to know that I can see and I can hear how scary this is for you. You're afraid that your family's falling apart. I would be afraid too. The person who feels ashamed, I say, I understand that you feel ashamed and that you really want to hide right now. Thank you for not hiding from me. I care. I'm here. Or you say to the numb person, sounds like you are in emotional shock. You don't feel anything right now. I get that. This is overwhelming. There may be too much happening for you to even know what you're feeling right now. Connecting, right? You want to keep that simple. The mistake that we can make at that point is what I call fixing. We want to help, but we end up communicating things, and maybe they're true things, but we end up communicating things to them that sort of invalidate what they just shared, that communicates to them that their emotions need to be tweaked or adjusted, that things aren't as bad maybe as they think. And again, these are things that you will probably naturally want to say that might be helpful at another time, but they're not meeting the need of the moment. So people will just sort of say things offhand, not knowing what else to say, like, well, these kinds of things happen for a reason. Or we have to remember together that God is in control. Or kind of our favorite standby verse, Romans 8:28. Well, we know this, that all things happen, God works all things together for good to those who love him and who are called according to their purpose. All true, right? All critically important truths, life-giving truths, but spoken at the wrong time, before you've entered in, or before they know that you've entered in, and it can actually feel like you're stepping away. Those truths can feel like, I want to create distance between your experience and mine. It has everything to do with timing and context, and have you done this first? Have you entered in first? I was asking some of my countless ladies, knowing that I was coming to this conference, what would you want me to say to people who are coming to learn about emotions? And one man wrote, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's true enough. He wrote, "Dear brother and sister, please let me suffer a little bit. Hurt with me before you try and make me feel better. The next one of you that watches me suffer and immediately throws Romans 8:28 at me is going to be sucker punched. In love." And then he says, and while the punch is still hurting, I'm going to remind you of Romans 8:28. So we've got more work to do, he and I. Third piece, care. You want them to know that you genuinely care about their experience, and that means allowing it to impact you. It means allowing yourself to feel it. So your joy becomes my joy, your grief becomes my grief. And I want them to hear that. I want to share with them how what they've shared with me impacts me. Again, keep it simple. I'm sorry that this is so hard for you. It makes me sad to see and hear you hurting so badly. I care about you. I'm here for you. Or this is a deep, deep betrayal. And I've never been betrayed that way. But I can see and understand how painful that this is, and I am so sorry. Or I hate that you feel like you need to hide. I am not judging you, and I am not ashamed of you. I am glad to be your friend. I am glad that you are sharing your heart with me. I think sometimes the mistake we can make at the caring level is we can get caught up in the difference between entering in and caring versus agreeing. Because sometimes people will share their experience and we're kind of like, well, what they're describing, either that it didn't really happen that way, they're exaggerating, or it's distorted, or their response is so strong, and potentially destructive that we kind of want to back off, and we want to engage in some kind of debate and dialogue. And again, of course we need to bring truth to people. It's an issue of timing. But often when people are sharing their experience with us, there's something true enough about what they're experiencing that we can start there. Recently, I was meeting with a couple who their adult college-age son died very unexpectedly. Obviously, just utterly tragic, kind of just a crushing loss, a blow to them. And so I'm walking with them in their grief. And one of the challenges for them was that they were actually having a different kind of experience in their grief. This couple just lovely people, really strong, faithful Christians. But in their grief, the husband was kind of saying, right now, I'm holding on to and I'm leaning into this truth that God is my Father. I don't understand things. This is more painful than I can begin to describe, but God is my Father. And the wife said, I don't want to hear that. I can't hear that right now. Don't talk to me about that right now. And as we were kind of talking about that together and processing that together, one of the things that I said is to the wife, I said, for you right now, I think God being your Father means it's okay for you to say it sure doesn't feel like it. And looking at Psalms together and groaning together at just how far away God seems in the moment. And to both of their credit, the husband was able to say to his wife, I'm processing it this way, and this is my genuine experience. Your experience is not worse than mine. Your starting point doesn't have to be my starting point. And your experience complements mine. And we can hold together in our grief in that way. I share that with you because that almost never happens in the counseling room, especially when something that utterly, tragic is happening. I'm used to hearing couples trying to fix the other person's experience rather than being able to locate what's right in it and start from there. But there's this beautiful picture of husband and wife being able and willing to be at different places and be okay with that in love. So I want to make it really clear because I know that this can be hard for people. I'm not saying that Romans 8:28 shouldn't be in the Bible. I'm not saying that God isn't in control. I'm not saying that you shouldn't say those things. I'm saying you do something else first. You communicate those truths by entering in and loving genuinely. And then there's a time, right? You do that first. Then there's a time to think about, how might God be speaking now? What can we hold on to together that will help? It's about timing. It's about sequence. Well, doing this make it look pretty easy there, right? With three steps. It's not easy. It's hard. And I've been doing this for quite a while, as a counselor for over 20 years. And it's hard. And it's not hard just because it's a skill issue. There is a skill to this, but it's hard in my heart to do it. There's something in me that always does it with a bit of fear, with a bit of trepidation. There's always a part of me that wants to hold back a bit from this process. And part of what I've come to understand is that doing that entering in process makes you incredibly vulnerable. Because to really enter into someone else's experience, you've got to be willing to connect with something inside of yourself that gives you access to their experience. If you're going to enter another person's grief, you've got to be willing to connect with your own grief, or at least your capacity to have grief. If you're going to understand another person's fear, visit with them in their fear, you got to be willing to feel fear. I don't like feeling fear. I don't like feeling grief. I don't like sitting with enraged, angry people. It costs me something. That's part of why it's so hard. I have to give myself into that process. It makes me think about Jesus' words in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verse 24. He's he's moving towards the cross, and he says to his disciples, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it doesn't produce fruit. Those who want to keep their lives are going to lose them. Those who are willing to lose them will keep them for eternal life. That's big deal, dramatic language, right? It makes sense for someone to be thinking that way on their way to the cross. But you know what? That big deal language is for you and me in very simple moments of relationship when we have to let go of ourselves to enter in to someone else's experience. When I have to take myself out of the center of concern, to leave my comfort zone, to set what's easy for me to the side so that I can focus on the needs of others. And it actually gets even harder than that, right? Because especially in our own relationships, in our own marriages, when is that other person really upset? When are they really asking me to enter in? It's when they're mad at me. I'm the source of their anger. I'm the source of their anxiety. I'm the source of their frustration. I'm the source of their disappointment. And now I get to enter into that, to not just feel how they feel, but to understand that they feel that way, presumably because of the type of person that I am. So there's a double death there. The death of my convenience and being comfortable, and the death of my lofty view of myself, my need to see myself as I really am, as I've impacted my wife or others. It's hard. But here's why we are especially called to do it. Love enters the world of the other. You're like, hey, I thought that's what we've been talking about. Sincere love. It is. But now I'm not just talking about love as your motive. I'm not just talking about love as something you do. I'm talking about love as a person. See, Paul in Romans 12, where he calls us to genuine love and rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn, he's not making this stuff up. This is not sort of Paul's homespun philosophy based on his experience with people. Paul knows what sincere love is and what sincere love does because he knows Jesus. There's a pattern in his mind because he knows this person, Jesus. It is the basic nature of love to enter the experience of the other because this is the nature of Christ himself. I want to take you to one other passage of Scripture before our time runs out. 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 to 12. I'll read them to you. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. God is love. If we're going to know what love is and we're going to walk in love, we don't start with ourselves, we start with God. And here's our starting point in knowing God. He sent his Son into the world to sacrifice, to pour himself out, to enter our experience. And so we ought to love one another. See, love leaves the comfort zone. Love leaves the easy place behind. Love leaves the side of the Father and enters into the brokenness. Jesus moves towards the heartache. God doesn't speak and act from afar. He draws near He becomes like us. He's become one of us. And here's a key point. We don't just see Jesus as sort of a super duper inspirational role model. We don't follow Christ into that just because we get jazzed by thinking about it, because we don't have that in our nature. If you think you can, of your own accord, kind of sort of gin up your courage and love people that way, it's just going to lead to a lot of frustration and a lot of anxiety and a lot of burnout, because you will be pointing people to yourself. We need to first know Christ's cleansing love. We need to know his grace. We need to know how he's entered into us, into our experience, and then he carries us, right? He carries us. He enables us then to enter into the world, the experience of others in his name. If you think you're going to sit next to brokenhearted people, betrayed, abused, addicted, rebellious, and you are going to heal them because you listen well, you're a disaster waiting to happen. You're going to hurt people. You're going to hurt yourself. We're not Jesus' substitutes, but because Christ lives, and he lives in us, and is always present with us and works through us, we can bring his love to others and bring others to him. But it gets even better. I just want to leave you with one final thought. And it's in this last verse of this passage. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. That line, no one has ever seen God. There's an echo here in 1 John from the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 18, says, no one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. This idea that no one has ever seen God is a very prominent, very important biblical theme. God lives in unapproachable glory, and in the scriptures, to see God in his glory is to be killed, to be overcome by his holiness and his glory, to die. And so you see this in Isaiah, right? When in the throne room vision that Isaiah has, and he sees God in the temple, and the temple's filled with smoke, and Isaiah says, woe to me, I'm an unclean man with unclean lips, and I live amongst the people with unclean lips, and I've seen the King, I've seen God Almighty, I'm going to die. That's what Isaiah says. Moses wants to see God, and God says, I can't let you do that. It'll kill you. But I'll put my hand over you, and I'll walk by, and I'll let you just catch the tail end of my robe or something when I pass by. You can get that kind of a glimpse, you'll probably live. Well, the Gospel of John says something pretty interesting, pretty incredible. The Gospel of John says, if you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. God has been fully revealed in Jesus. But John also says no one has ever seen God. Interesting. In this verse, though, in 1 John 4:12, no one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. In other words, in some mysterious way, God becomes more fully manifest in our lives and in our relationships when we live and walk in his love. You can't, in one sense, you can't see God, but in another sense, you can if you love one another well by his grace and by his Spirit. Do you want to be a part of that? I do. That's worth living for. That's worth counseling for. Every moment, you have an opportunity to make Christ more visible in this world. Every moment is a sacred moment. before you fix anything, before you ever dispense one piece of advice, enter in, understand, care. These are powerful, powerful ways of loving, not just good advice, but a way that love is made perfect, brought to completion among us.